Welcome back to another episode of the College 12 Pack. I'm your host, Tyler Natuno, and with me now and moving forward is my new co-host, Ryan Haley. Ryan's the managing editor of Duke Wire, and he's a good friend of mine. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Hey, how are you? Does it feel good to be the host chair now?
I know it's a little different. I haven't done this intro before, so we're kind of just running through this and figuring it out as we go along. But yeah, it's pretty exciting. I mean, when you think about it, we're kind of coming down the home stretch of the offseason here. We're like, 3 Saturdays away? We're going to have football on our TV. Georgia Tech and FSU playing in Dublin. So it's pretty exciting. And if you've been tuned in for the last month or so on this show, we've been running through, preseason conference previews for the Power Four now, not Power Five.
That's
but today
adjustment period.
Oh yeah. Oh, I've messed that up multiple times. Don't worry about it.
I'm going to keep messing it up.
Yeah, it's going to be weird. But I think, to me, today we're going to take a step back from the power conferences and look at the group of five, which, to me, I think finds itself in a really interesting spot kind of at this era in the sport, because to me, there's two competing vibes here. On the one hand, I think there are serious existential concerns about the group of five moving forward and how they're going to compete, in an NIL landscape and in a transfer portal landscape where you can't even develop good homegrown players because they're going to get poached somewhere else. But then at the same time, the new postseason format does guarantee them a spot in the college football playoff. They don't have to have essentially 2 seasons of perfection the way that Cincinnati did a few years ago. So I think that's an interesting dynamic, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think it's going to be fascinating. I'm really curious to see how teams kind of responds to that. With Cincinnati, like you said years ago, there was the added pressure of needed perfection, but there was an element of just being under the radar the entire season, just because even diehard college football people like us weren't really taking the idea of that. Even right before they announced the playoff, it was still pretty convinced they were just going to throw in a different Power 5 team instead. So now knowing that those games not only are consequential to the diehard group of 5 truthers, but consequential to the college football landscape period, there are going to be teams I guess I don't want to spoil who we're going to talk about later on, but there are going to be teams that are playing with genuine national championship pressure in November, December. And that's going to be a really fascinating adjustment for teams from the American, Conference USA, everywhere else.
Absolutely. Because think about just in the past, what it took, when we were talking about UCF being in this conversation, when Cincinnati in Houston in the conversation, when Cincinnati ultimately put themselves in the conversation, it took an undefeated season leading into another undefeated season in which you had Notre Dame on the schedule, in which you had Indiana on the schedule. It took a lot of fortune for Cincinnati to even find itself in that situation.
So I think they got rewarded with Bama.
And you know what? They gave Bama a better game than Michigan gave Georgia. People forget.
Absolutely.
People forget that. But yeah, so I mean, as we're moving in and looking at some of these teams, I think that's worth keeping in mind that these teams are not afterthoughts in college football anymore. They matter to the overall landscape. And when you're looking at the 12 seed potentially drawing a 5 seed, I don't think there's any guarantees that the 5 seed is going to win that game. So I think it gets really interesting. And we're going to start this off just with, I think, a pretty obvious starting point is, which offensive players are going to make the most noise at this level of football this year. And we'll start off with yours, because I think yours is kind of the guy that if you're maybe more of a casual fan, at least of this level of college football, this is probably the name you're most familiar with.
Yeah, I think so. I took Caden Salter, the Liberty quarterback, on our call sheet, and is kind of becoming a bit of a lineage of Liberty quarterbacks at this point, following in the footsteps of Malik Willis. But for those who are unfamiliar, running through his 2023 stats, last year, Salter completed 61% of his passes and averaged 9.9 yards per attempt. So basically 10 yards an attempt. He threw for 32 touchdowns, ran for 12 touchdowns and 1,000 yards, and only threw 6 picks. So if there's going to be a group of 5 quarterback on a team successful enough to enter Heisman conversations, that puts up volume numbers successful enough to enter Heisman conversations, this is the guy you're looking at if you want to go down any board and see who's a dark horse pick for an award. I think he entered the transfer portal and chose to remain with Liberty instead of leaving, which I think is a pretty landmark thing that was pretty under discussed, especially considering, like you were saying, like there's a guaranteed group of 5 spot. And I don't see how Liberty isn't among the top 2 or 3 favorites, if not the prohibitive favorite for that spot, given their success over the last few years. Um, and a guy who is gonna be a threat to throw for 3,000 yards and run for 1,000 more, and probably put up 40 total touchdowns this year on a potential playoff team is going to make national awards news.
Yeah, totally agree with that. Like if you want to find like who's the guy that's not a power conference player that could end up being a Heisman finalist, I think this is the safest pick because like I agree with what you say. I think Liberty has a really good chance of finding themselves back in that conversation again this year, not just because of what they return, but just I think being in Conference USA where there really just isn't a clear team that's going to challenge them for that crown. I think they've come in and really run this league right off the bat. And yeah, you talk about the sorry, what were you saying?
I was going to say there are fair nitpicks. They played Oregon in the Fiesta Bowl and got absolutely obliterated.
Mm-hmm.
And Salter played in that game, and they're fair nitpicks. He did not finish with a phenomenal QBR, but he completed 15 of 24 passes for 126 yards. And so even in a game like that, where you're playing against a team that, for my money, Oregon was maybe the best team left out, like probably the second best team behind Georgia left out of the college football playoff last year. Um, Even like in a game like that, he still put up a respectable stat line. There's not going to be a team on Liberty's schedule anywhere close to as good as Oregon was last year.
Yeah, and also in fairness to Liberty, that Oregon team like didn't have opt-outs. Like Bo Nix played in that game, so
Yeah.
they actually like that was a more like legit opponent than even like Missouri beating a Ohio State with a ton of opt-outs in the Cotton Bowl or whatever. Like I think that. And like you talk about the lineage of Liberty quarterbacks, like it's a pipeline really of the SEC to Liberty. Like Malik Willis started his career at Auburn, Caden Salter started his career at Tennessee. But I think your point about him not entering the transfer portal was really key. And as I think as we get into the show and talk about more of these guys, that's going to be kind of the recurring theme here is, the guys that were just tremendous wins to keep them from going somewhere else bigger.
And you have to think that the guaranteed playoff spot has to be probably the biggest reason that he was able to stay with Liberty. I mean, if Jamie Chadwell can't look him in the eye and be like, if we win 12 games again next year, we're going to the college football playoff, I guarantee you Caden Salter's in a Power 4 school right now. And maybe that would change his draft type a little bit, but like that's going to, I don't know. I know you and Patrick have probably had extensive conversations about the new playoff format coming into this year, but that like, for a much longer conversation to have about the pros and cons of the 12-team format, that is going to be one of the pros is schools like Liberty are more able to like convince top talent to stick around.
Yeah, because I mean, the case, like, say, this isn't based on intel, just like hypothetically speaking, say, like, South Carolina really wanted Caden Salter in the transfer portal. Like, Jamie Chadwell can make a convincing argument, like, hey, you're not going to touch the CFP if you go to South Carolina this year. You might here at Liberty. Yeah. So, yeah, I think that's a pretty good point. And yeah, like, I think to me, when I'm talking about my guy, it's another guy who I think was, the team was pretty fortunate not to have enter the portal. A guy on a team that's not necessarily expected to compete for a playoff spot, but I think could take a significant leap this year. I've got Byron Brown, the quarterback from South Florida, who, I mean, really promising last year, was a really fun player to watch. I think he has the potential to be elite this year. At 37 total touchdowns last year, 11 of those were on the ground. So a really versatile, dynamic player in this offense run by Alex Galesh, which I think is really exciting. Coming in from Tennessee, like transplanted that offense really well. And Byron Brown was such a big reason for why they ended up having a surprisingly pretty successful season last year in year one. Now, I think efficiency is a bit of a concern here. Like, through 11 picks last year, that's not ideal. You'd like to see that come down a little bit this season. But I do think that, like, he has the potential to be really, really good. And if you're looking for a team that's maybe going to be a dark horse in the American, I think this is one to keep an eye on just because of, how much of a bad situation it was deemed to be going into last year and the success they had, like, especially in an American conference that, we question like what's going to happen with Tulane. They lose a good amount, including their head coach. SMU is in the Power 5 now. Yeah, all the teams that left prior to 2023 are obviously gone. So I think there's kind of a power vacuum here in the AAC, and I don't really see any reason why at least this year's iteration of South Florida with a quarterback like Byron Brown couldn't be in the mix for that.
Yeah, I have more conversations on South Florida to mention later later in this podcast as well. But even looking at, like you were saying, sure, efficiency, he still completed almost 65% of his passes, which is pretty unheard of for like a dual threat college quarterback. Like almost always, even Salter was hovering around 61% last year. But almost always, guys like that are kind of closer to the 60% range than anywhere close to 65. So even with the interceptions, there's some questions about his risk taking. But I know this is probably not the best example because they were also going through a coaching change and are going to be a very different team. But they they played two Power Four opponents last year that I can see at least in front of me right now. I'm pretty sure, unless I'm blanking on one of these teams actually being a Power Four. I'm pretty sure I'm not. Um, Alabama, you can almost throw out. That's not really a fair fight, especially in week 3 for
And
South
even
Florida.
then, they
But
gave them a good fight. Like that
yeah,
was a
17.
competitive game.
Yeah, 17-3. But Syracuse, they absolutely just obliterated in the Boca Raton Bowl. 19-26 for 214 yards and 3 touchdowns against a Power 4 team. Like, yeah, Syracuse did not have a great year last year. Yes, they're going through a coaching change, but it's really apparent that South Florida didn't just beat up on the lower opponents on their schedule and then wilt against top opponents. I know Syracuse isn't exactly like the cream of the crop in the ACC, but that's still punching up out of their weight division, and they still managed to more than hold their own.
Yeah, absolutely. And for where this program was at in the Jeff Scott era, like that is really hard to imagine that they got to that level in just 1 year. So I'm really high on this team. And again, like you said, we'll get more into that later. But I think a lot of that centers around a quarterback in Byron Brown that I think just has the potential to be so fun. I think he was the guy that, college football 25 fans were like thanking him for how good
Yeah.
he is in the game. I think that,
Yeah. Can confirm I
yeah,
played him, and I have a UF Dynasty working, and I played him in the second season. He went like 26 of 31 against me. So
yeah.
incredibly infuriating, but
Yeah,
they're
I think he
definitely
has
high
the
on him at EA.
absolutely, and I think it's for good reason. Like I think he has the chance to be a really really fun player this year. But looking at the defensive side of the ball, I think this is a little bit more interesting because I think these guys don't necessarily get the same love. Like you can be a superstar quarterback at the G5 level and get the national attention. Not necessarily the case at the Group of 5 level. But the guy I've got here is Jaden Voisin, a safety from South Alabama who entered, like Caden Salter, entered the transfer portal last year and was getting SEC attention. If I remember correctly, Florida was in the mix. Ole Miss was in the mix. I think Auburn was in the mix. But he ultimately stays at South Alabama, even amid a coaching change with their head coach, Kane Womack, leaving to be co-DC at Alabama. He's still there. And I think, a guy that could be starting in the SEC right now, like when you look at his production last year, 71 tackles, 4 picks, 7 pass breakups, like, I think this guy is going to be an absolute stud in the Sun Belt this season, and such a big, such a big move for the new coach Major Applewhite to keep him around. I think we'll see what this defense looks like. I mean, Kane Womack is such a good defensive mind, and I think was a big part of the success that unit has had the last couple of years. But with that being said, I think having Jaden Voisin back is a huge get, and I think it is a reason why you can have some optimism about this program, even though it's maybe not in the best spot. Had a disappointing year last year, and then obviously coach leaving to be an SEC coordinator is not the best look, but big win for them to get him out of the portal.
Absolutely. And if you're talking about his how he projects at the next level as well, being able to produce, even if he doesn't 100% match his production from last year on the defensive end without Womack, being able to show his competency and show his prowess as a defensive back in a different system, which it's going to be a different system, even if you try and retain as much of Cade Womack's uh, blueprint as you can. It's going to be a different system, and being able to show that again with a different coaching staff and with a different team around him is going to be massive. Um, but like you were saying, this is just kind of tough at the Group of 5 defensive level because we're sitting here trying to pick our defensive player of the year at the Group of 5 stage, and the answer is probably going to be someone we haven't really heard of much. There's going to be some sophomore or junior who comes out of nowhere who just got playing time this year, or who transferred in from a different school who just takes the thing by storm. But a guy who I thought didn't get a ton of credit for like being incredibly productive on a really, really good team last year is Miami, Ohio linebacker Ty Wise. He finished last season with 122 total tackles and 8 sacks. I think he's one of only 2 linebackers that I found, or one of only 2 defensive players in the country last year with 100 tackles and 8 sacks in the season. Um, and he also deflected 5 passes and came away with an interception. And he did all of that for a team that ended up winning its conference championship game against Toledo, in a game that I don't think really many people expected them to hang against Toledo. I know Quinyon Mitchell, obviously in the NFL now, but that was a team that had a lot of hype going into the MAC championship game. And Miami, Ohio, ending the regular, and yes, they lose in the curable to Appalachian State, but ending the regular season on a 4-game win streak and then winning the conference championship. That's a 3-loss season is exceptional. And being a linebacker who is second on his team in tackles and second on his team in sacks in the same season, he's going into his senior year. He stuck around. Started his career at Indiana in 2021, but he really kind of broke through last year in a big way in his first year, getting like major dominant starting minutes. And I don't see a way that looking at the state of the MAC for this season, I don't see a way that Miami, Ohio, and Ty Wise aren't just as productive this year.
Yeah, I think I fully agree, especially on just generally speaking about this team. Coming off the best season they've had at least since Ben Roethlisberger was playing here. And they returned quite a bit. In addition to Wise, they get their quarterback, Brett Gabbert, who was injured for most of last year. Like, he wasn't even playing, and he's one of the best G5 quarterbacks in the MAC, one of the best G5 quarterbacks in the country. So, yeah, I think there's reason to be high on this team. And what I thought was fascinating was Miami, Ohio has a linebacker on the preseason watch list for the Nagurski Trophy, and it's not Ty Wise, which is kind of unbelievable considering, like you mentioned, the production, 122 tackles and 8 sacks. Like, that blew my, like, I had to look at that a couple times when I was doing my notes to make sure I wasn't misreading that, because that just didn't even compute. That's an unreal level of production. No, I mean, I really like this team and this program. Like, I think Chuck Martin has done such an underrated job. I mean, as we'll kind of talk about more, I think MAC coaches in general aren't getting the credit that they're due. But I think this one's really just has been not talked about enough for what they've done here. But yeah, I think they're poised for another really strong year, like you said. And, if Ty Wise can produce even like 80%, like what he did last year, he'll probably be the MAC Defensive Player of the Year. And if that happens, he has a good chance of being one of the best defensive players at this entire level of football.
And this is like, I think the MAC especially, I think Miami, Ohio is the dominant option for the two of us. I think we would be in agreement there. But the MAC especially, I think, is not really getting the attention it deserves. Of like, this is another team that is fully in consideration for that group of 5 at large spot in the college football playoff. And I don't think it's out of the question with a little bit of a combination of a little bit of uncertainty and some deeper competition in the American. With the Memphis coming back, Tulane's going to be Tulane could kind of go any direction from here. South Florida is going to be really good, but there's a really, really realistic chance that like a 12 win team wins the MAC and ends up in the college football playoff, and it's really just not getting talked about at all.
Yeah, and I'll just tell you this. I just pulled up Miami, Ohio's schedule. They will have the opportunity to prove themselves because they start the season on the road at Northwestern week 1, week 2 at home against Cincinnati, week 3 on the road against Notre Dame. So, and then they have Toledo in week 5. So we're going to know a lot about this team very early on, know a lot about what their odds are of competing for a playoff spot. But I think we both are pretty optimistic that this team will probably be back in the MAC championship at the very least. But everyone
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
But yeah, that's actually and playing a team like Notre Dame early in the season, I'm sure there are, again, longer conversation to have, and there are gripes about the system, but knowing how the college football playoff selection committee works, if they start 2-1 with like a 1-score loss to Notre Dame, that's almost a more impressive way to start their year than starting like 8-0 in MAC play. Like, that's a really good. Again, you could have a longer conversation about whether or not the way the system should work this way, but knowing that it's how it does, like a team like a similar example, like Tulane playing Oklahoma early in the year, like those are games that now there's an at-large spot confirmed for the playoff. the margin for error almost gets easier. Of like before, it felt like if you didn't win this one game, the whole season was wasted because it didn't matter if you go 11-1 if you lost to like this Power Four team. But now a team like Miami, Ohio against Notre Dame can give Marcus Freeman and his squad a fight, and all of a sudden it becomes a argument for them later in the year.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, yeah, like just in general, I think everyone's margin for error is expanded with the new format. But yeah, everyone we've talked about so far, the kind of tying thread between them is they were all players that were on their teams last year and very productive for their teams last year. But now we're going to talk about guys who were not on their teams last year, who are newcomers to their teams. So looking at newcomer of the year, Ryan, you've got a guy who I think is maybe one of the more impactful transfer additions, like pound for pound for, who they are and the team they're on, could be one of the more impactful transfer additions we'll see in the entire country this year.
Yeah, I mean, so I chose Memphis running back Mario Anderson, who transferred from South Carolina after running for 700 yards and 3 touchdowns for the Gamecocks last year. This is a guy who's kind of bounced around college football a little bit. South Carolina was his first year at I believe it was his first year at the FBS D1 level, if I remember correctly. But was the leading rusher, gashed several really good SEC defensive lines throughout the year, and now he's coming to a Memphis program that lost Blake Watson, its leading rusher from a year ago, who had almost like more than 1,100 yards. He'll be playing alongside Seth Hennigan, who's another one of the best group of five quarterbacks that we have in the country. Uh, this is a Memphis team that's retaining a lot of its passing game production and lost a massive vacuum of carries. Blake Watson had 192 carries last year for the Tigers. And there are some other good utility running backs on that Memphis roster. But speaking of, I know we talked about the pipeline of Liberty quarterbacks. Memphis running backs have been an absolute factory for more than a decade now. And I think this is a guy who runs really fast, runs really physical, is really hard to tackle with like in one-on-one situations. And inserting him into a team like Memphis that's also going to like throw for close to 4,000 yards and 30 touchdowns this year is just going to be an absolute nightmare for American defenses to keep up with. It's part of the reason why I'm really high on Memphis. Again, conversations for further on in the podcast, but part of the reason why I'm really bullish on Memphis and what they're going to be in 2024 is dropping Mario Anderson to a team that was really, really productive passing the ball last year and didn't really lose much of that production.
Yeah, for sure. And you are right. He previously, I looked it up, played at Newberry, Division II Newberry,
Yes.
prior to going to South Carolina. So, but his first year audition at the FBS level and the Power 4, Power 5 level, it was Power 5 last year. This is hard. But his first season at the Power Conference level was a good one. Almost 5 yards a carry running the ball for South Carolina this year. I think had 700, or this past year had almost 700 and something yards, or had 700 and something yards. I think maybe the only concern here, it's like you said, I think the pass game, with Seth Hennigan and what they've got returning, like probably going to be pretty good. Maybe the concern I have is that he's running behind, a semi-heavily portaled offensive line. I think like 3 projected starters or newcomers. And I think, it just has been a recurring theme. Like we don't really know how effective that is. I think there hasn't been quite a big enough sample size in the transfer portal era to know like whether you can effectively portal multiple starters on an offensive line and have cohesion there. So I think we'll just kind of have to wait and see how that works out. But I mean, I think if Mario Anderson can do similar things to what he was doing at South Carolina this year, he's just going to be another, add another element to an offense that was already very productive and a team that we already expected was going to be pretty good this year.
Yeah, I agree with you on the offensive line point, but I think Memphis, intentionally or not, has kind of unlocked the ultimate path to that of if you're not sure about the offensive line and you don't really want to rely on these transfer portal guys like all hitting, because it's hard to go even just 2 for 2 on transfer portal starters in the offensive line. And I think Memphis has either consciously or subconsciously decided that the best way to counter that is just force teams to have 5 defensive backs on the field at all times. Um, and that's kind of where I'm coming from with the decision for Mario Anderson is he averaged more than 10 yards an attempt against Tennessee and Vanderbilt. The 2 separate games, he had 101 yards on 10 carries against Tennessee. Um, so this is a guy who has already kind of managed to be a bowling ball in the conference that is most known for how physical its offensive line play is. And so even if the offensive line at Memphis doesn't hold up against American competition, I don't know if American defensive linemen are going to be able to give him the same challenge that SEC defensive linemen were. And I don't think teams are going to be able to afford to put 6, 7, even 7 guys in the box against Memphis.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. A guy who's mostly already proven himself. I think we just need to see how it fits with the new team. And I think that's kind of also the case with who I picked for my newcomer of the year. I've got Jordan McLeod, the Texas State quarterback. To be honest, this is a move that I kind of forget happened. But it's a big one. Like Jordan McLeod was insanely good last year at James Madison. I think had 43 total touchdowns to 10 interceptions, like really productive. And now he's coming into an offense with GJ Kinney that like this could be electric what we're about to see this year. In year one, I think Texas State was way better with Kinney than we expected they would be. And when you look at what they did with TJ Finley, a guy who previously had played at LSU and Auburn and not very good. Not a lot of promising moments earlier in his career, had a complete turnaround last year, was like legitimately very good and effective quarterback for Texas State. I think McLeod's more talented. I'll be honest, like I don't completely understand the logic behind this move. I'm not sure why you would leave James Madison to go to Texas State. But with that being said, I think Texas State is going to be a major beneficiary from it. And I could see Jordan McLeod being even more productive, just given the system he's going to be playing in with, I think, one of the brightest young offensive minds in the sport.
Has any coach nailed the like transfer portal NIL era of college football like GJ can through 1 year? Because I feel like he's got to be the coach whose stock has risen the most from where it was 15 months ago.
Yeah, absolutely. This job was nothing. Like no one had really found ways to be successful here. The previous coach, Jake Spavital, kind of made the fatal error of focusing too much on the transfer portal to the detriment of relations with high school coaches in the state of Texas, which if you're a college football coach in the state of Texas is a pretty big no-no. You can't really survive. Yeah, you can't really survive without good THSAA relations. So I think that they're taking the steps to kind of rectify that. And I'm just curious what this team can be. I think maybe we make the same error with a lot of these Texas teams. Like I think we did it with North Texas for a while of maybe thinking that because resources and potential exist, that it will necessarily be, seized upon. I think we'll have to see, what the ceiling actually is for this Texas State team. But I really like what GJ Kinney's done through just a year and some change here. And I think they could be poised to take another step just because I think Jordan McLeod is an improvement over TJ Finley, who was already really good last year.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add. It feels pretty comprehensive about my thoughts on Texas State.
Yeah. So moving away from players, because we talked about who we think are going to kind of be the stars, be the names you're going to know on the teams that we kind of think are going to be in that conversation for that playoff spot. But looking at coaches, which coaches do we think are going to make a name for themselves this year? For me, it's a guy, like we kind of went different directions here. Like I went with a guy who's more veteran that I think is going to kind of finally put it all together this year. You have a guy who's at least new to his current job. For me, I've got Jason Candle from Toledo, who honestly, I think has maybe done the most thankless job in college football over the last 8 years, however long he's been there. They are consistently so good every single year. They recruit at an elite level relative to the MAC. So you can pretty much guarantee year in and year out, this is going to be the most talented roster in the conference. And they haven't gotten over the hump a ton. I think they've only won the MAC actually one time in the time that Jason Candle's been there. But a guy that just, they do so well. And I think to me, I look at, what they lost. They lost a quarterback in DeQuan Finn to Baylor. So they're not running this back. But I think you look at Tucker Gleason, who was the backup there, has kind of only seen sporadic action, but has been, I think pretty solid. You could, I think, be mostly optimistic this is going to be a turnkey operation at quarterback for Toledo here. So yeah, I mean, if we talk about Miami, Ohio, I don't think either of us would be surprised to see these two teams play again in the MAC championship next year, because I think they're going to be among the better teams in the league. And to be honest, I know this isn't something that Toledo fans want to hear, but I think that there's a pretty good chance if they do have that kind of season that you're going to kind of finally see Jason Candle get that next job. You know, he was rumored apparently to be in the mix for the Syracuse job, didn't ultimately get it. I don't really know why this guy has not gotten the opportunities. I mean, even his predecessor, Matt Campbell, had to leave for an Iowa State job that was certainly not a great job at the time that he took it. He sort of raised its stature a little bit. But I think, I mean, truthfully, like, this is a conversation for a different day. But I think if Jason Candle doesn't get, if they have another really good season, like another 10 plus win season, and Jason Candle doesn't get that bigger job, that power conference job, I think it's a real cause for concern for this conference. You know, I think they really need that kind of thing to happen, because it kind of looks like it's a graveyard for coaches at this point. Like, there's not a lot of paths forward when you're in the mix here. And I think it's really telling when you see like what we saw this past offseason, a successful coach, Mo Linguist at Buffalo, leaving to be a position coach at Alabama. Like, this is not a great state of affairs here. And I think for the good of the conference, they probably need Jason Candle to get that next job, just so there can be some proof of concept. Like, hey, your career is not at a dead end if you come here.
Yeah, you actually took that in a direction that I should have expected but was not expecting, which is like more of the commentary on the MAC in general. But he's definitely one of those coaches that I think if you showed any college football fan his blind resume, they'd assume you're showing them one of the like 15, 20 most popular coaches in the country. Um, and yeah, Toledo's just like kind of that weird space of like a good enough program that you don't get massive credit for winning 7, 8 games a year, but not a good enough program that 7, 8, 9 wins a year is a guarantee. Um, and even like even producing a second round pick like Quinyon Mitchell, first round pick in Quinyon Mitchell. Oh my gosh. Um,
Top
uh,
5 pick, right? Wasn't he? Or at least top 10.
no, he's
Wasn't
top
he? Oh,
20, I
no, you're
believe.
right. You're right. You're
Yeah,
right.
no,
You're right.
he went to Philadelphia, so it was like top 25. But still,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, I mixed him up with I knew Key and Cooper DeJean were Philadelphia's first 2 picks, and I mixed up who went
Mhm.
first. But yeah, Quinyon Mitchell, first round, like produced a first round draft pick in the NFL, and it's still like pretty lukewarm attention. So yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think just it's frustrating too because it feels like this isn't the same Mac we were watching 5, 6, 7 years ago. In terms of and part of that's the transfer portal, and part of that is players finding more starting opportunities in junior senior year. But this isn't the same conference that was just kind of like the like weekday bonding activity for college football fans on Twitter. Like this is a very serious conference that, like we've said a few times in this podcast now, has a very real chance of making the college football playoff. And I couldn't agree with you more that I don't see a way if he wins 9, 10 games, I don't see how there isn't some Power 4 program knocking on his door.
Yeah. And I think the action point you made is an interesting one, because I think you could maybe even argue that that has had a net negative effect. I think it was some good exposure and branding for the conference right off the bat and kind of put it on people's radar. But now you're kind of dealing with the downsides, which are like you're playing by October, you're playing almost all of your games on a Tuesday or Wednesday night. That's never going to be the same kind of atmosphere as it would be on a Saturday. You know, it makes hosting recruits a little bit tougher. Like, I think it's maybe become something of a disadvantage when it started off as a unique thing that helped this conference out. But you're taking us outside of the MAC for your coach of the year, and you got a newcomer. Who do you got?
Yeah, so I picked John Sumrall at Tulane, and this is a guy who, before he took the job at Tulane, when I was just looking at his resume as the head coach at Troy in the Sun Belt, I actually told you, just as a conversation as friends, that I think this guy is going to be a Power Four, I guess now Power Four football coach by 2026, like at the latest. So I'm going to read you Troy's record over the last 5 years, and I want you to tell me what year John Sumrall took over the program. 5-7, 5-6, 5-7, 12-2, 11-3.
I
Just
know the
immediate.
answer to I know the
Yes,
answer to this question, but yeah.
I know you're the worst person to play this game with because you've forgotten more about college football than anyone else has ever learned. But yeah, like taking a program that had won 5 games each of the previous 3 years and winning 12 games in your first year and getting ranked in the college football playoff at the end of the year is an astronomical achievement. Um, he walked into a Sun Belt that had a very clear pecking order. There were some programs that had kind of been running the Sun Belt for a while, whether it was Appalachian State or I guess they were kind of the big one at that time, but like there were
Yeah.
programs that were like
Coastal
Troy
too.
was,
Coastal was
yeah,
good. Yeah.
yeah, Coastal Carolina, of course, the Jamie Chadwell. I was thinking of a
Mhm.
coach who left for another school, and
Yeah.
I couldn't put two and two together for some reason. But yeah, Grayson McCall is another big transfer. Um, but this like went 15-2 in conference play over the last 2 years. Now he's taking over a job at Tulane that um I think I go back and forth a little bit on how high my expectations for Tulane are going to be for year one, because I think expecting them to really throw elbows for that college football playoff spot in year one seems a little unfair, especially when it seems a little unclear who Tulane's quarterback is going to be. They got Ty Thompson, the former four-star prospect from Oregon. Maybe I think four-star. I think he was four-star last
Yeah.
time
He
up.
was a top
Um,
50, actually. Top 50
yeah,
out of high school. Yeah.
yeah. So they got Ty Thompson, the former Oregon quarterback. But everywhere I've read from, I believe NOLA.com reports on them a lot, says that it's a pretty open competition with two or even three different players competing for that job. So I think there's fair questions to ask about whether or not Tulane will be ready to win 11, 12 games in year one. But then you're also looking at, he walked into Troy, a program that was pretty listless after three straight 5-win seasons, and immediately won 12 games with them. And now he's walking into a Tulane program that has been pretty exceptional for the last 5, 6, 7 years. Um, so I think there's more than fair expectations to think that this could be a team that really throws its weight around in the American Conference. And I think John Summerall is going to be a name that if he can put together two or three 10-win seasons right off the bat and in Tulane, he's going to take a bigger job than people expect. Because that, like, if you can stack like a program transformation like you did at Troy and then sustain success at another very big school on, I know it's Power Four and Group of Five. The American Conference is pretty clearly the fifth biggest conference. Like now with the Pac-12 dissolved, the American Conference is pretty clearly the fifth conference in college football. Um, and if he can make that step up and make that transition pretty seamlessly, this is going to be a guy that SEC and Big Ten fan bases are clamoring for in 2 or 3 years.
No doubt. And to me, the thing that's like, I think most interesting about John Summerall's immediate success at Troy was that he wasn't like some guy that came in and like we were all really like high on. He wasn't some hotshot offensive coordinator from Alabama or Auburn or whatever. They tried that previously with Chip Lindsey. Wouldn't really call him a hotshot coordinator, but it didn't work out. But he came in, a young coach. I think he was like 32 or
He's
something.
42. He's
He's
42
40.
right
Okay,
now.
so he was older than I realized when he got the Troy job, but still like a young
Even
coach.
still,
Was previously like a linebackers coach at Kentucky, so not like a
yeah.
big name in the assistant coaching ranks.
He was
I mean,
Mark Stoops' co-defensive coordinator for one season before he got the
yeah.
Troy job.
Okay, so he did have that co-DC title. I didn't realize that.
2021 is the only year.
Got it. But speaking of Mark Stoops, like you talk about this guy being an SEC coach by 2026, I think if reality had broken just a little bit differently and A&M had followed through on hiring Mark Stoops away from Kentucky, I think John Summerall is the first call they make. And I think there's a pretty decent chance he's the head coach of an SEC team right now, if that had happened. But I think it's really interesting at Tulane because not really a team that we thought, prior to their emergence with Willie Fritz would be in these kind of conversations among G5 teams. But, credit to them. They've put their money where their mouth is, literally. They're stepping their game up. This program wants to win, and they're resourced. It's a very rich program in a big city in the South. Like, they have the resources, and they seem pretty serious about winning, poaching. I wouldn't say it was a lateral move for John Summerall. I think this is a better job than Troy, but it's not the clear upgrade that like Kentucky would have been. But there's a reason he saw it as an upgrade, I think. And I like this roster. Sorry, was I?
Sorry. I was going to say, to the point that you were making about putting their money where their mouth is, it feels like Tulane is very quietly following the same trajectory that SMU has followed now. Now SMU is now an ACC team, but a school that's in a like very easily marketable city to recruits, that has a very wealthy alumni network that is now putting money towards that football program, really like becoming a top program in the country. And obviously SMU is going to get more attention for both their program history and being in Texas and now being a member of the Power Four. But Tulane is very quietly like a half step behind them on that exact same upward trajectory.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think this year's roster, like I think we probably expect a bit of a step back this year because you're losing Michael Pratt, among others. But I do think like there is potential here. Like you mentioned, Ty Thompson. They also got, Mario Williams previously at Oklahoma and USC. Like I think both of those guys we have questions about. Neither of them are like proven commodities by any means, but they were both former top 50 prospects. Like they are very talented players relative to the American Athletic Conference. And I think they could have a pretty successful year one. Like as we've talked about, there's not clear contenders in this conference really. The one that would have been the clearest contender plays in the ACC now. So I think that you could really easily see them making that kind of jump to getting to the playoff with John Summerall. We already saw them get the New Year's Six spot 2 years ago. They would have been in the playoff under the current format back in 2022. So like it doesn't take a big stretch of the imagination to see them getting there under John Summerall. And if they do, like, you'll see this guy have a top half, like the next top half SEC job that opens. Like, he'll probably be a shoo-in for it.
Is there a reasonable world in which Ty Thompson doesn't win the starting job and Mario Williams has like 400 yards and 2 touchdowns next year? Yeah. Is there a reasonable world where they're also both like first team All-American, or like not like All-American conference, I should say, not like national All-American, but like first team All AAC guys? Absolutely. And if that's the case, like it's not like the top 1% of outcomes. That's the top like 20% of outcomes. And if they both emerge as those caliber players, this is very clearly an 11-12 win roster.
Yeah, and also brought in quite a few players from Troy, both in the trenches on the offensive line and from the defense that have been very, very good over the last 2 seasons. So I think plenty of reasons to be really optimistic about Tulane, even though you lose sort of the architect of the modern program in Willie Fritz. Also,
do want to point out if we're talking about it's like I feel like it's fair to point out if we're saying like I agree with every point you made about like Tulane isn't the clearest upgrade over Troy. Summerall was the Tulane co-defensive coordinator from 2012 to 2014. So there is like some history with the program as well, which I'm sure is going to make it even more impressive for the alumni network and for his ability to kind of pitch himself to future recruits for however long he's there. But it sounds like we both don't think he's going to be there for more than 2 or 3 years.
Probably not. And even honestly, like it wouldn't shock me if this was a 1-year rental. Wouldn't shock me. I think that would probably take something kind of surprising happening.
I think you need to win a playoff game, but it's like within realm of possibility.
Or if Mark Stoops and Kentucky just have a divorce after all this season.
Sure.
Maybe.
Sure.
But a lot of interesting potential with that program though. But, I think now we've talked about 2 teams that we both expect are going to be near the top of their conferences. Looking at now teams that maybe aren't expected to be there, but, we think that if things break the right way, maybe they could find themselves in those discussions. One of them we've already talked about a little bit on this show, your pick. You've got South Florida here. So tell me why you think they could make some noise in the American this year.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to spend too much time. I've monologued quite a bit on this podcast already, but we both kind of covered a lot of those reasons when we talked about Byron Brown earlier on. But this is an offense that I think just has a really good combination of like solid 2 to 3 yard gains and explosive potential. I think Byron Brown, like a lot of those touchdowns you were talking about on the ground, were not like 2 or 3 yard like some kind of play where he like follows a wide open path into the end zone. These are like 30, 40, 50 yard scrambles that he's just like producing pretty consistently. And he's managing to do that in a system partially because of South Florida spreading out defenses as much with how much speed and talent they have on the roster. I feel like I'm kind of just restating a lot of what we talked about with Byron Brown earlier, but this is a team that has big play potential that other defenses are going to fear, and they're walking into a conference that has a bit of a power vacuum right now. And I do still think, despite how real I think that was last year with that 45-point bowl win over Syracuse, like multiple multi-score victories over the last like 2 months of the season, I do still think they're a half step behind the Memphises of the world in the American Conference, but I don't really think it's unreasonable to think this team might win 8-9 games.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that's kind of the reasonable progress that we expect to see from this team this year. And I think you kind of summarized it all pretty well. All I would want to add is I think just looking at, kind of the more macro view of this program, like not just this year, but the trajectory it's on in general. I mean, just a few years ago, things looked pretty bleak for South Florida. I think they had their moments in the aughts and in the early to mid 2010s where they looked like they were, on the cusp of becoming a nationally relevant Group of Five program. And then, they had some down years. They were surpassed by UCF, who then got that bid to the Big 12 that they wanted so badly. They kind of let themselves get, outspent and passed on by their rival. Now I think, the trajectory is maybe looking up again. I mean, I think since I've been paying attention to college football, the idea of USF getting its own on-campus stadium has kind of been like a joke, like, oh yeah, I'll believe that happens when I see it. Well, it sounds like it's actually happening. Like they are moving toward doing that. I think that's going to be huge for this program. So, if they can keep Golesh around, who I really like I think the trajectory is good here. I think even if maybe this year does fall short of that, and they're kind of more just in the 6-7 win range again, to me, the outlook is so much sunnier than it was just even like 3 years ago. And for a team in the Group of Five in modern college football, I think that's just about all you can ask for.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of if we went on the whole tangent about what the coaching jobs are going to become available to John Sumrall, since 2020, Alex Golesh has been the UCF offensive coordinator, the Tennessee offensive coordinator, and South Florida's head coach for last season. And I think that's really what stands out to me watching USF play football. And we talked about this before, like the spread offense, how much talent, speed there is like you watch USF play football and it's pretty apparent that a Josh Heupel disciple is like coaching that offense. And that's going to be another guy. Like we know how young offensive coordinators, especially young like spread offensive coordinators, are really kind of running college football right now. USF wins 8-9 games again. There are going to be calls for Alex Golesh to see how much money it would take.
Yeah, absolutely. He'll have some suitors if they keep up at this pace. You mentioned earlier that the American is kind of pretty clearly in the modern age, the fifth next, or the fifth conference, the next up after the power conferences. And I agree with that. But I think if you wanted to play devil's advocate, you could say that the Sun Belt has an argument for the teams they produce, at least at the top end in the last few years. And I want to look at a team, for my surprise team, that isn't really talked about as a team that could win that conference or even finish super high in it. But I think a team that very quietly changed the narrative quite a bit last season. I've got Arkansas State with Butch Jones. And, this program, they're interesting to me. They're really interesting to me. I'm very curious what kind of season they have because this job, we thought for a long time that this job was as turnkey gets. The amount of coaching turnover they had in the last 10 odd years is ridiculous. And it didn't matter. They were consistently very good always throughout it all. That's kind of changed. And it looked like Butch Jones was heading for a disaster going into last year. I mean, they were 5-19 through his first 2 years. It looked like he was going to be one of the first coaches fired last year. Well, they turned it around, not entirely, but they went 6-7. And to me, that was pretty good progress, all things considered. And they showed signs of progress. To me, most importantly, was finding a quarterback. Jalen Rayner emerged near the end of the year as the guy for them. And I think, was good, not great from a production standpoint, but I think you got to be really optimistic about what he can be, what his potential can be for this team this year. And like I talked about at the top, when you have a good player at this level of football, you always have to worry that they're going to get poached. And we know that tampering happens. So it's, you have to re-recruit these guys. Well, they managed to keep Jalen Rayner here. So I think anytime that you can keep a guy that emerges like that on your roster at a school like Arkansas State, it's a huge win. I think they could be a dark horse in this conference this year. I kind of think this team pushes for the 8-win mark, which would be fantastic. I mean, Butch Jones looked like he was dead in the water this time last year. So I think if they're in that range, that's an awesome season.
Especially given the power vacuum for changes at Coastal, John Sumrall leaving Troy, Appalachian State is a little more inconsistent than they were half a decade ago. There's a very clear opportunity for a team like Arkansas State to step in and take a little control in the Sun Belt.
Yeah, they to me are probably the next team up. Maybe you want to talk about Georgia State. They've got a new coaching staff too. a late addition coaching staff too. They were one of the teams that sort of had to deal with a late change with a coach leaving to be a position coach somewhere else.
Which is
But I think
also hurtful, as we talked about earlier. But yeah.
Oh man, like yeah, I mean, and I think some of these are different than others. Like I think some of these cases make more sense than others, but like it happening at Buffalo is one thing. It happening at Georgia State, which doesn't really have a lot of history. It's a newer program, but it's a massive school right in the heart of downtown Atlanta, like a lot of resources. If that is being viewed as a dead end job, like the G5 has concerns, but that's not what we're here to talk about today.
No.
Because there are reasons for optimism at the G5 level. And like we said at the top, the main reason for that is because now the best team in these ranks is guaranteed a spot in the college football playoff. So looking at that, of all the teams we've talked about, who do you think is the team that if you had to pick right now is in best position to get that, what we probably expect will be that 12 seed? And I have a feeling I know what direction you're going in here.
Yeah, I mean, I'll keep this a little short and sweet. I think the group of 5 position is going to come down to the final game of the year between Tulane and Memphis, and I think, or final game of the regular season, I guess, for the two of them in the American Conference. And I think Memphis is going to end up walking away with that game. I think this is a team that has the most explosive potential in the group of 5 without as much or without as many questions from new coaches, new players. I think Mario Anderson's probably the most reliable transfer we've talked about. Running backs feel like a pretty known quantity. So yeah, I think Memphis has just an explosive offense they did last year, this year, and I think that they end up walking into the college football playoff.
Yeah, I mean, I'm high on this team. I do think there's a decent amount of pressure here going into this season. I think Ryan Silverfield probably was on the hot seat before the run they had last year where they got to 10 wins. I think prior to that, I think 8-5 was his best season at Memphis. Not really up to par with where they expect to be, but like we've talked about, really productive quarterback and Seth Hennigan is back. They brought in some nice transfers on the defensive side of the ball. And I think, like you've said, they're the favorite to win the American this year. At least I think they should be. And they need to make some noise. Like this needs to be a year where if they're not the playoff team, they need to at least be in that conversation in November, I think, with the roster that they've got.
I think with the reputation the American has, if a team wins the American with one loss, they're in over a undefeated MAC champion, Sun Belt champion, any other Conference USA, like anybody else. I think if a team goes 12-1 and wins the American, I think they're in.
Yeah. So for me, I'm going to take my pick to a conference we haven't talked about yet, which is the Mountain West. Defending champion Boise State, coming off a really weird season, fired Andy Avalos after a 5-5 start, and then interim Spencer Danielson comes in, finishes the year 3-1. And they actually win their conference. I think he became the first FBS interim to ever do that. And I think they're interesting coming into this year. They lose their quarterback, Taylon Green, who's transferred to Arkansas, but he was pretty inconsistent. And I like the move they made to replace him in Malachi Nelson, who was a 5-star quarterback at USC where things didn't exactly work out. But man, you've got to love the potential of a guy with that kind of talent on this team. Like that's just something Boise State hasn't really had. And then when you look at his top weapon in Ashton Jeanty, the running back, like a guy that honestly, as I was putting together my notes, I was like, maybe I should have made him my offensive player of the year because 1,300 yard rusher, 14 touchdowns last year, almost 600 yards receiving out of the backfield, like crazy production. And they returned veteran.
It would have been embarrassing if we hadn't talked about Boise State at the some point in this podcast.
Absolutely. And they're loaded, like not just on offense. They return a lot on defense, very veteran group, top 25 in defensive returning production, according to ESPN's Bill Connolly. So to me, like the Mountain West hasn't really been a factor in these discussions for the last few years. I think that's going to change this year because I think Boise will be a team in the mix for that playoff spot.
Yeah, I think Boise was the only team that I was willing to look at outside of the American as a team that, again, not because of how I feel about them, but because of how I feel about the selection committee. I think they're the only team outside of the American that has a realistic chance to be taken seriously enough if they win 11, 12 games. But speaking of like taking a job by the horns, I don't want to like downplay Spencer Danielson or like diminish his resume, but I don't think there's a chance he takes like Boise State's a pretty impressive job given their histories of like so far this century. I don't know if Spencer Danielson is really their top choice or even on their top three choices if he doesn't come in and win those last few games and win that conference. So, speaking of like a completely trajectory altering month, like that might have set him up for an entire career in coaching.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I think this is a desirable job. If this had gone to the open market, like there will be people there would have been people that would have wanted this job. Quite a few of them. But Spencer Danielson coached his way to the full-time spot, so credit to him. And I think they're have a chance of making some noise here in his first full-time season. But that brings us, I think, kind of raises the obvious question here. They're guaranteed one spot in the college football playoff, but they're not limited to one spot. It's they could get an at-large team. Yeah. They're not officially limited to one spot.
Yeah.
So, and I think, we're kind of answering the question for ourselves as we pose it, but do you think that they can get a second team in? And I think we're both in agreement. The answer is probably no.
I don't think so. I mean, the only thing I can think of is if a team like Memphis beats a Power Four school and goes 11-1 and wins the American, and Boise State goes undefeated. But I still think they're more likely to put in like a 3-loss SEC team before they do
100%.
that. So
yeah,
I wish it were true, but I don't see a path.
Yeah, the fact of the matter is that this format was put in place to get as many SEC and Big Ten teams into the playoff as possible, not to expand opportunities for the group of five, though it did do that.
I'm sure we're going to have conversations on this podcast throughout the 2024 college football season about how the 12-team format has changed the urgency of the regular season, but this is very clearly serving those two conferences.
Absolutely. Well, I think that kind of covers. I think that's a pretty thorough, at least as thorough as you can be, talking about 5 conferences in one podcast. But I think that kind of covers at least the teams that we expect, the teams and players that we expect to kind of get the most attention from this level this season. I think just kind of looking back at some off-season news we've haven't really addressed on here yet as we prepare for the season. I think one thing that is worth talking about. Alabama renaming the stadium, renaming Bryant-Denny Stadium's field to Nick Saban Field. How do we feel about that? I almost feel like his name should be on the stadium itself. I
was going to say, I think you have more of a firm take on that than I do. I think it's a pretty great problem to have to choose between naming your college football stadium after the best coach or the second best coach in college football history. And I obviously have my own opinion, but I'm not going to sit here and really argue between like Nick Saban or Bear Bryant, but it feels like a pretty luxurious problem to have, to be like, how much, who should we name after what? But
yeah,
I tend to agree with you, but I also don't really necessarily think that Saban Field is like a disrespectfully low level of honor for a guy that kind of ran the college football world for 2 decades. I think getting his name somewhere on the building was the minimum, and I think they did that.
Yeah, and all I'll add is neither of us here can speak for the sentiments of the Alabama fan base at large. No. I'll just say I was talking to Matt Scalisi For the Win about this, and he mentioned to me that there's some people, at least a vocal contingent within the fan base, that doesn't want George Denny, who's the Denny part of Bryant-Denny. He was a president early half of the 20th century, did a lot, I think, to fundraise and put Alabama kind of on the map. But I think it'd be hard pressed to argue that he's had the same kind of impact on the university that Bear Bryant and Nick Saban have. But yeah, that's kind of the main thing there. I think it's interesting just to me that it's happening so quickly after Saban retired. But he's a legend of the sport. So
yeah,
what else are you gonna do? And then just one last bit of news to end on here. Something pretty funny, a little bit of a lighthearted way to go into the weekend. Did you see what Nick Saban said about the transfer portal?
Saban
or Nick? Oh my God. Sorry, Dabo Swinney. Did you see what Dabo Swinney said about the transfer portal?
I did, but I think for the audience, you're going to have to be a little bit more specific.
Yeah, so Dabo Swinney, essentially, to paraphrase, he said, if I were to leave Clemson and take a different job, I would be the king of recruiting in the transfer portal. Which, Awesome, man. Awesome line, Dabo. And you know what? We're gonna
Oh
make fun of
man,
Dabo. We're gonna make fun of Dabo for this, and rightly so.
so
But before
much.
we do that, I want to say he has a point here. And his point is that Clemson retains players at a much higher rate than like Clemson doesn't have the need to be aggressive in the portal the way that other programs do, simply because of, the fact that they don't lose guys. Granted, they still lose some guys, like Bo Collins, one of their top receivers last year, plays for Notre Dame now. Will Shipley, their top rusher from last year, is in the NFL. Would it have been nice to go out in the portal and find experienced replacements for those guys? Yes, especially when you're no longer recruiting, at least consistently at the top five-ish level that you were for at least a while.
Sure. I guess it wouldn't be. I wouldn't be being true to myself if I didn't make some silly reference while I was on here in my first appearance. Have you ever seen the Richard Linklater movie Everybody Wants Some?
I've not.
Okay. It's a movie about like following like a 1980s baseball team around for like their first weekend before classes start, college baseball team before classes start. And there's one like older transfer who keeps like insisting that he was drafted by the MLB and how he like can throw 95 miles an hour the entire weekend. He's just like annoyingly bringing up the same points and like a very clear effort that he's lying. And it just kind of feels like Dabo every time he talks about the transfer portal. It's like, no, I would have like 15 commitments if I wasn't at Clemson, I swear. It's like, yeah, okay, sure, man. Like,
Yeah, it's like
I don't really know what
I don't
really know what else to say to Dabo. I don't really know what else to say to Dabo at this point. Just like sure.
It's like he has a point. I mean, like they do like no other program in the country could have like the floor would fall out if they ignored the transfer portal the way he does. So like I guess he gets some credit for that, but it's like at the same time, this team is no longer nationally competitive, or at least it hasn't been for a few years. There's a reason for that. You're falling behind. You're like the talent-wise, your blue chip ratio, you are falling behind.
I get that this is a high bar to hold any program to, but it's the bar that like he didn't win 10 games for the first time since 2010 last year. You don't get to do that and insist the sky isn't falling and we're actually being silly for saying that it is. Like you empirically had your worst season in 14 years.
Yeah.
And I don't know what to say, man.
And I think if they're kicking around 8-4 again this year, I think these conversations are going to start to ramp up. But yeah, I mean, I think there's at least some potential if Cade Klubnik takes a leap that they, could get back to being competitive for a playoff spot. But yeah, man, like
do you want to commit to Cade Klubnik taking the leap?
No,
yeah,
I don't.
I didn't think so.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think like ultimately, yeah, the more quotes like this Dabo has, the worse it's going to look if the trajectory just continues to, even if it slowly drop off from where they were. But I think that's going to just about do it for this week's episode of the College 12 Pack. Thanks for tuning in, and join us next week as we maybe get into which coaches find themselves in danger of being on the hot seat as we enter 20. Could be some interesting names that we discuss. But thanks for tuning in. We will be back next week.
Thank you.